Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar titled Data Integrity in Decentralized Clinical Trials, or DCTs. This webinar has been sponsored by Actu-Real, so a huge thank you to them for helping to make this webinar possible. Joining us, we have 4 experts participating in today's event. I'm happy to introduce Dr. Chitra Lele, founder and president of Actu-Real, who is a strong business leader with proven expertise in both strategy and operations. Next up, we have Dr. Daniel Gutierrez, Director of Customer Solutions at Clinarion, who is responsible for managing the hospitals that can form the Clinarion network. Our third speaker with us today is Dr. Pierre Etienne, co-founder and chief medical officer of Actu-Real. Pierre has extensive experience in both the pharma industry and in academia, research, and clinical practice. Finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Clifton Chow, a health economics and outcomes research consultant at Actu-Real, who has over 20 years of HEOR experience. My name is Sydney Menson, and I'm your host for today's event. Just before we get started, I'd like to share a few housekeeping notes to help you get the most out of this session. First, if the webinar panels look too big or too small, you can zoom in or out in your internet browser to adjust the viewing area. You can also resize some of these panels or even make the media panel full screen. Next, if this webinar is being recorded and the video and its associated resources will be made available following the event. Please send your questions, thoughts, and comments to us using the Ask a Question box next to the media window at any time. We'll be taking your questions in a Q&A session after the presentations. You can also take a look at the resources panel where you'll find some links associated with today's event. We'll also be running a few audience polls during the webinar and a survey at the end, so please share your perspectives with us. And lastly, if you experience any technical issues during the event, the easy fix tends to be a simple refresh of your browser. However, if this doesn't work and you continue to have issues, just use the Ask a Question box to communicate your issue with our team, and we'll help you get back up and running. Before we jump into the presentations, we're going to launch our first poll. So this poll asks, does your organization use centralized statistical monitoring for clinical trials? So please select yes or no, and we really appreciate your participation in these polls. So does your organization use centralized statistical monitoring for clinical trials? And I'll give everyone just a few more seconds here to submit your answers. Perfect. Just a couple more seconds. Please submit your answers. Great. Okay, and with that, I'm going to bring Dr. Pierre Etienne on. Hi, Pierre. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you, Sydney. So in traditional monitoring, you do source data verification, but this is no longer possible in decentralized clinical trials because data is collected at the source or is reported by the participant. But data integrity remains essential, of course. So to present this issue, we have organized the webinar in 4 sections. They could be presented in any order, really, but we chose to start from the perspective of the sponsor or CRO, and then to the perspective of the trial side, and then move to the perspective of the mobile healthcare provider, and ending with the perspective of the developers of data integrity software for wearables. So Chitra will describe how centralized monitoring strategies can help aggregate and analyze data in real time. Danielle will describe how the Clinarion, the company he works for, the Clinarion platform transforms diverse global data sources into one wearable data model. I'll talk about the expanding role of mobile healthcare providers and how they help protect data integrity. And Clifton will provide a comparison of several artificial intelligence binary classifiers for detecting data integrity issues with wearable sensors. And with this, I shall introduce Shitra. She's the founder of Actu-Real, as Sydney mentioned. She is a serial entrepreneur. This is her second company, and the previous one was, I think, quite successful. She has a PhD in statistics from Stanford and quite a career in industry and academia. She is also, this is an unusual combination, she is also a card-carrying actuary. And we've known each other and have been friends since 1996, and I'm quite proud of that. So without further ado, I'll let Chitra move to her presentation.
Thanks, Pierre. The plan is we will start with basic context setting. So what are DCTs? What does monitoring mean for DCTs and how it has evolved? Some of you who are attending, or many of you may be familiar with this. There is a lot of talk about DCTs, and many of you are probably also involved in decentralized trials. The benefits of DCTs are pretty well known, but just to call them out, both from the perspective of the sponsors as well as the perspective of the patients. For patients, DCTs are very patient friendly and better retention especially is good for the patients also, because it will lead to better outcomes. And on the other hand, the recruitment speed and reduction in time and cost, etc., is of help to the sponsors as well. There has been a lot of development in terms of digital enablers that are making DCTs more and more possible, and making it very easy to conduct DCTs, although there is a lot more that can be done. So some of those are the e-consent kind of tools, then the telehealth visits that we will hear more about subsequently, and the various tools related to the electronic patient reported outcomes, electronic clinical outcomes assessment, and the wearable sensors, etc. And remote monitoring is something I will touch upon a little bit later. Patient engagement platforms is the other evolution that has made it possible to conduct effective decentralized trials. Now, of course, there are challenges in terms of the kind of data that are typically involved in decentralized trials, and these challenges also, along with them, bring opportunities. There is, of course, high volume of data and heterogeneous data that comes from many disparate data sources, and also the data tends to be quite dynamic. It doesn't necessarily follow data standards. There are data security risks, which all lead to data monitoring challenges. And on the other hand, the opportunities are that we can detect patterns, we can explore novel endpoints, and there's a lot of advanced analytics that can be run on these data. So a large majority of the trials are projected to use digital health technologies in the next few years. Even currently, we know that digital health technologies are being used for regular trials, and even more so for decentralized trials. So the usage is going to be more and more for decentralized trials. And decentralized trials are supposed to, expected to grow over time substantially. The digital data allows us to capture both the objective and the subjective endpoints. So on ePROs on one side and the sensor and wearable kind of data on the other side. And the depth and breadth of data from all these sources requires special considerations when it comes to monitoring the data, reconciling the data, etc. So we will briefly touch upon those challenges and considerations. Centralized monitoring has been used for a long time, has been talked about for a long time, several decades. centralized monitoring, centralized statistical monitoring. These concepts are pretty old, but they are being applied more and more now, and they are even more relevant in the context of decentralized trials. So centralized monitoring is, as against the traditional monitoring where retrospective source data verification is done. This is taking a more holistic surveillance kind of approach to data and trying to identify issues that are more serious than could be identified by just routine transactional data reviews. Centralized monitoring, as we can we can imagine, will work best when data can be aggregated so that there is an optimized way of looking at data holistically and in an aggregate manner. So data aggregation from siloed and disparate systems is critical to do effective centralized monitoring. And the strategies are built upon this kind of a unified data platform. And the biggest advantage is that this allows us to have a unified picture of the patient journey, the performance of the patients, and overall health of the trial. So all dimensions of how the trial is going. Similarly, centralized data management, as against we talked about centralized monitoring. Now, we have to realize that in the context of DCTs, especially, the line between monitoring and data management is pretty blurred. It's not that much difference in what those two concepts mean. But again, the traditional data management approach is not effective for decentralized trials when we have a lot of digital health data from various sources. There has to be a lot of real-time and proactive data management, data cleaning, data verification, and the risk-based data management strategies become extremely important. There is obviously a risk due to the way the data are collected and aggregated from the various disparate sources. We already mentioned that they may be in different data standards. And hence the focus of centralized data management, especially for DCTs, is on the core processes and the critical data points that are most likely to impact data integrity and data interoperability. When it comes to DCTs, of course, there is a lot of non-CRF data. And there are special considerations when we think about verification and monitoring of non-CRF data. So ECOAs and ePROs, with respect to these, there is a challenge to ensure that patients are compliant with completing the questionnaires and the diaries. And also when there is, part of the data is patient reported and part of the data is collected during procedures or assessed by the physician, then both these sources of data collection, both the subjective and objective outcomes, are merged, and they have to be sort of compared to make sure that there is some level of consistency. Then it's important to detect misconduct. So system audits can be done, geotagging, etc., to just make sure that data is coming from the source that it's supposed to come from the location it's supposed to come from, etc. If there is a lag or a variability in the way the data flows as against what's expected, then there's a question as to whether it is a signal that something is going wrong. There is also a question as to how do you define non-compliance in case of data streaming. Again, it will depend on the nature of data and the way it's coming in, but this is also an important question to keep in mind. And there is, at the end of the day, a somewhat higher risk of fraudulent data or misconduct in DCTs, especially when the data is coming from ePROs and wearables. So these are some unique or specific considerations when we think about data monitoring for DCTs. Centralized statistical monitoring, as I mentioned, is not new as a concept. It's been close to 3 decades old. It's a combination of centralized monitoring and statistical monitoring. Now, statistical monitoring, as the term suggests, includes statistical tests, statistical algorithms, and the initiative Transcelerate has recommended algorithms and how certain algorithms and processes can be used for statistical monitoring to discover data outliers, to discover any data anomalies, and also to guide risk-based monitoring. The statistical monitoring is used on all data and all variables that influence data quality. It relies on the fact that data are highly structured when they are collected as part of clinical trials, and each protocol is expected to be implemented consistently at all the sites. So the difference in the sites can be identified because we expect all sites to be collecting data consistently. Also, the multivariate structure or the time dependence of the variables, these are sensitive to deviations, and the multivariate structures are a little hard to copy. So some of the statistical, tools are based on the fact that it's going to be difficult to fabricate data in a way that these multivariate structures can be adequately reproduced. And then there are other advances, like there is Bayesian centralized statistical monitoring. So just quickly to introduce the benefits of CSM. Again, we have kind of partly seen. I'll just call out a couple of points. They help a lot in providing or in improving the risk-benefit monitoring strategies, and proactively, early real-time detection and identification of data anomalies. And they can also be an effective tool in oversight of the CROs. Just very briefly touching upon statistical monitoring and what Transcelerate prescribed. These are the various, some of these are basic statistical tools and tests and approaches that we know of. It's just that their application for statistical monitoring is being called out here, and it can be, the application is a little customized when we are using these tools for monitoring. But essentially, these include looking at correlations, looking at standard deviations, maybe just doing some descriptive and visualization, and ANOVA tests, chi-square tests, all the basic tests. Most of the basic tests can be utilized for statistical monitoring. There's also a concept, a measure called Mahalanobis distance, MD, which is particularly useful. So this basically measures the distance of a point from a distribution. So it's a multidimensional risk assessment method based on a multidimensional risk score to detect inliers and outliers. So very briefly, instead of trying to talk about an example, just to make sure that data privacy, etc., is not compromised, I've just mentioned here, reproduced from this reference mentioned below on the slide, an experiment that Transcelerate did to test how these various statistical monitoring processes and tools and algorithms can be used and how effective they are. So they did this on a large data set from a COPD clinical study with 178 sites and more than 1,500 patients. And they fabricated the data selectively and implanted it. Vital signs and evaluations that are there at each visit. So hence they selected SBP, DBP, pulse rate, etc. FEV1 and FVC were selected because these data were collected serially, and these are produced mechanistically and evaluated centrally. So there is less chance for human error. So essentially, they kind of made sure they picked different types of data which were suitable to apply these methods and to test the effectiveness of the methods. So they calculated the Mahalanobis distance for each subject and also study-wide separately for the vital signs and spirometry. A large MD for a subject would correspond to an outlier, and a small MD corresponds to an inlier. Also analyzing or assessing the carryover effect and repeated values. So carryover effect is where values tend to be repeated for a subject from one visit to another, and repeated values is just the number of identical values across visits for a subject. There's also this issue of digit preference and rounding, which can also be tested and analyzed through these methods. So they concluded the results were that the algorithm identified several sites that had fabricated data. So there was a little bit of variation in how well the algorithms performed for certain sites. The sensitivity specificity was particularly good for one of the sub-studies than the others. The conclusion from this was that this is very effective, but that it also requires a cross-functional and a collaborative approach, because various experts have to be involved in analyzing and interpreting the results that come from these. Just to close out this part of the discussion, these statistical monitoring techniques have a limitation in the sense that they're not that effective when the data are low volume. So a site may not be flagged if it is small, if it has a small sample size, etc. And then there are ways of getting around it. There are adaptive algorithms that can be used, and there are other things that can be done. The approach to the statistical monitoring can still be applied even if the data are not large or the number of sites is not large. So we can do similar things. It's just that statistical testing may not be very meaningful. And also, a way to get around this and to progress this to the next level is increased use of AI and ML for pattern and anomaly identification and automated statistical analysis, which some of the platforms are trying to incorporate. We will also hear more about AI and ML later. And just coming after this, we will hear about how platforms can enable or enhance data integrity. And before that, I'll hand over to Sydney for the next poll.
Thanks, Chitra, for that informative presentation. Okay, so as she mentioned, we're going to move, before moving on to our next presenter, we're just going to run this poll. So this poll asks, are you currently involved in clinical trials or real-world studies that use digital health technologies? So please submit your answer by clicking either yes or no and submitting that now. This really helps us to guide the conversation as well as guiding our Q&A session at the end of this, all of these presentations. So I see some answers coming in now, and we'll give you all a few more seconds here. Are you currently involved in clinical trials or real-world studies that use digital health technologies? Perfect. Last couple of answers are rolling in here. And with that, I'm going to move on and bring Daniel to the floor. Daniel, take it away whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Sydney. So first of all, thank you everyone for being here. Also, thanks to Chitra, Pierre, and Clifton for inviting me to this event. This is a great continuation from what Chitra presented. What basically we're going to talk about here is how platforms enable a global interoperable patient network for trial feasibility and recruitment. This is a solution that has been created by our company called Clinarian. A small disclosure, we belong to Informa. So I wanted to put that out there. And with that, I basically start. So I think it's loading. Okay, there it is. This is our global network. We are a basically a network of hospitals that have a reciprocal agreement with Clinarian. What we have created is the ability to enable the medical research community to query these hospitals. And we have created the ability as well to look at the patients in a way that the data flows from those hospitals to support clinical trials. In the next slide, we see the type of data that we work with. So this is data that is in these 5 data categories. So we have diagnosis, procedures, medications, demographics, and laboratory test results. Why this is important? The reason is because with this data, you are able to create inclusion and exclusion criteria with data that has been created by the hospital itself. However, there is a challenge, and when it comes to data integrity, you want to query things that you can actually work with. You want to query information that is harmonized. So what Clinarian does is that we map independently of the coding systems for those concepts that the hospital is using. We map those data among each other so that the results that you see is harmonized. So that means that you could be querying a hospital in Croatia as well as a hospital in Brazil and finding patients just with one single protocol, even though Croatia and Brazil might be querying different data in different types of coding systems. For example, SNOMED, ICD-10, ICD-9, as well as when it comes to medications, we have ATC, barcode, SNOMED, etc. And therefore, you have a more harmonized way to see this data. In the way it works, we create an inclusion and exclusion criteria where we are able to add all these data concepts, and it's very flexible. So we can, for example, create the ability to query patients only in the last 6 months, but that before have received X or Y or Z type of treatments or medications or procedures, and then maybe after certain others. So what I'm trying to say is that this is very dynamic. This creates an interoperability of all these data concepts to start filtering for patients that fulfill all these conditions. What you see on the screen, for example, which is this overall query, that's the number of patients at the top left. That's the number of patients that fulfill that very stringent inclusion and exclusion criteria. Now, the question is, when you want to see where those patients are, we also provide in this platform the ability to see where the patients are located on a per hospital basis. So when you see, for example, in the green circle at the top left, this number, it reflects where those patients are located based on the selection of hospitals we have generated. Here we see, for example, that the distribution of these patients goes accordingly to these hospitals, and we are able to extract the gender distribution and an age range of the patient distribution. And then we go hospital by hospital, looking where we have the larger concentration of patients. And this, of course, allows clinical research organizations, pharmaceutical companies to scout and pre-screen patients that might be enrollable for clinical trials or whose data might fit a retrospective study or a prospective study. In the next slide, I want to present an additional benefit of doing this type of querying, and it's the ability to identify who the patients are. However, this is something that happens internally at the hospitals. And something that I didn't mention is that all these querying capabilities happen without the data, the raw data of the patient leaving the hospital. So that means that the data stays in a protected environment. And we have created this system that, by the way, we also patented to ask questions to the hospital and get aggregated data counts. Now, when it comes to identifying the identities of these patients and, of course, potentially enroll these patients in a clinical trial, we go from those aggregated data points to a system called Patient Finder that identifies who are those patients that fulfill the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And therefore, inside the hospital, and I want to be very clear that this is something that happens inside the hospital, the principal investigator or anyone that has the proper credentials is able to very granularly see who the patient is, validate the patient, pick up the phone and ask if the patient wants to be enrolling in this specific clinical trial. Additionally to that, when you click one of these patients that you saw on the square before, you can display the full electronic medical record, download it, look at who is the treating physician, look at who is the case, which is the number of the case ID, and most importantly, at the top left side, which is the patient ID number. Why this is important? Well, additionally to the structured data that we provide, we know that there is a lot of other data, clinical images, genetics, pathology reports that might be interesting to also gather. And based on the protocol, what clinical teams can do is with this number go and add data that is related to this patient, and of course complement that information to make informed decisions during the enrollment process. I want to show a little bit how technologically speaking all this works, because what you see is that we are able to create protocols, but how do we make decisions when we send that protocol to all the hospitals that belong to this network? What we have then is a system that when you see the right size square, the big one, that is the hospital. And you see that the line around it is the hospital firewall. And inside you have the hospital information system, which is at the right bottom side. The hospital information system contains all the sensitive data of the patients with names, birth dates, contact information, etc., together with the electronic medical record of the patient. So what we do is we enter in this reciprocal agreement with our hospitals where they allow us to implement a so-called ETL server. And there is this ANIT technology that we patented. And what this does is that it extracts the information from the patient and filters data that is sensitive, leaving that sensitivity behind, and passing that electronic medical record information to the so-called Clinarion server. However, when that happens, the data is de-identified at that point. And then in the Clinarion server, that data becomes ready to be queried. So what we have done is basically a mirror copy of the hospital information system, but in a way that is now queryable in a secure environment where the data has been created by the hospital. So that means that this adds to the data integrity capabilities. We don't have bias in data that we might extract from the hospital and then gets manipulated. And then on the other hand, outside the hospital, we have these clouds on the left side. That's where all the query happens. So CROs, pharmaceutical companies, they are able to design queries and send it to all the hospitals that they are choosing. Could be all the 100 hospitals of the Clinarion network, covering all these 250 million patients, or just one, or maybe one region, or maybe one country. And with that, we are able to really gather this information from the patient without violating general data protection regulations that are increasingly adopted by countries these days, and of course make informed decisions with the name of hospitals that might be selected for the study. In the last slide, I want to present new developments that we are working on that also adds to data integrity. So besides the classic way Clinarion is able to query data from patients, now you see a new system, which is the cloud that is in green, a little bit below the upper one. This is a system that allows pharmaceutical companies and CROs design their own artificial intelligence algorithms. So we're talking about neural networks, for example, that are able to send to our hospitals and deploy training. This training happens with the same data that the hospital is producing, and in the same way that we are doing it with the classic view of Clinarion, But in this case, we look at additional data like free text data, for example, and maybe other data that might be complementary to the learning process of these algorithms. After that, the pharmaceutical company extracts the knowledge and is, of course, able to train these systems and make decisions based on what it has observed. So because we have 100 hospitals, this learning happens in a federated fashion. So that means that these algorithms can cover a wide range of hospitals around the world in different countries with different backgrounds, genetic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds. And this, of course, helps to be more inclusive in clinical research. So with this, I finish my part of the presentation. I hope that this adds to the explanation of what has been lately developed in technology to be able to query more patients, to be able to work with hospitals around the world, hospitals that are in places that are difficult to access for these type of studies, and of course, accelerate clinical research and decentralized clinical trials. So thank you very much. I pass it now over to you, Sydney, and look forward to many questions.
Fantastic insights, Daniel. Thanks. Okay, so we're doing one more poll for this section. So I will launch that now. This one today, have you ever conducted DCTs using a strict telemedicine approach? So no visit to the research center, no in-person or physical visit from a mobile healthcare provider. The answer options for this one are yes or no. So please submit your answers. I also want to take a moment to remind you to submit questions to this Ask a Question box wiggling on your screen here. And we will be getting to those in just a few moments. So have you ever conducted DCTs using a strict telemedicine approach? Yes or no? I'll give everyone a few more seconds here. All right. And with that, I'm going to bring Pierre back on. Hi, Pierre. Welcome. Please go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay, Sydney, thank you. So Daniel has shown us how his company enables pharma sponsors or CROs to query sites to find the appropriate participants while protecting or without compromising patient confidentiality and security. So a successful query will yield participant candidates who then can be invited to enter a clinical trial. And the trial can be of the traditional type with visits to hospitals or clinics, or of the decentralized type, where visits take place at home, with a physical presence or via telemedicine tools, or both. And there are all kinds of ways of mixing traditional and decentralized approaches. Now, I won't repeat what Chitra already said, but I'll show just start from the last point on the slide and add that the improvement of trial access is often enough contingent on the contribution of mobile healthcare providers. And these are, the people who transform clinic visits into home visits, real or virtual. Essentially, mobile healthcare providers remove obstacles to participation. By reaching out to the participant at home, they decrease her burden. As a result, they make it possible to have longer trials with more frequent visits, with participants who are more compromised physically or mentally and have difficulties with traveling to their clinic. And also, as a network of healthcare providers, they can even follow participants who travel to a milder climate on a seasonal basis. Now, DCTs are no less demanding when it comes to data integrity, no less demanding than traditional trials. Since 2016, regulatory bodies have provided guidance to investigators to maintain patient safety, data quality, and trial integrity. But the essential elements of the definition of data integrity remain as valid today as they were in 2016, and we can easily understand how mobile healthcare providers can contribute to data integrity. And these contributions, as you will see, are changing and expanding. Traditionally, the role of mobile healthcare providers in the context of a clinical trial or routine care included blood draws, clinical assessments, and treatment administration. Participant education was also a component, and reinforcement of education received in the clinic was often necessary. And the last point is they had a role in verifying adherence to treatment by doing pill counts, for instance. But the role of mobile healthcare providers is changing. To start with, they replace the personnel a participant would have met in a research clinic. And so they become de facto the face of the trial site and the face of the CRO behind the trial. Some of the traditional tasks, such as blood draws and clinical assessments, have remained unchanged, but new tasks have been added. For instance, it's not rare for a mobile healthcare provider to have to reassess the participant's understanding of a patient report outcome instrument. And this needs to be done whenever the data flow is found by the central monitoring staff to be interrupted or corrupted. And often enough, there will be a need to provide basic IT support, and when required, be necessary to coordinate IT support with the specialists at the site or the CRO. So, in the absence of clinic visits, the mobile healthcare provider inherits some components of the research coordinator role, the traditional research coordinator role. And it has been said that mobile healthcare providers are in the best place to evaluate the social environment of the participant, which is a key variable that influences treatment outcomes. So now I'd like to say just a few words about the progress achieved in the field of portable imaging and how this could be added to the role of the mobile healthcare provider. Photos of skin lesions have been used for clinical assessments for a while. This technology has recently been enhanced by AI algorithms for interpretation, but now there are many new devices available for deep structure medical imaging, and some of those devices are really portable, they're handheld, and particularly for ultrasound imaging. So I would dare to predict that it won't be long before such instruments are used by mobile healthcare providers for the imaging of organs, provided that a secure transmission can be established and interpretation done by a licensed radiologist. And one could imagine applications in many therapeutic areas. So we can expect that the role of mobile healthcare providers will continue to expand, but this expansion needs to be accompanied by proper training and certification. So this needs to be done, and this requires considerable effort and expense on the part of the trialist or the CRO, or both. And one cannot just, turn a visiting nurse or a nursing assistant into a competent mobile healthcare provider without a bit of training. Most trialists actually expect that the popularity of DCTs will increase, but an evaluation of the clinical trials landscape by Ken Getz of the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development suggests that small trialists that have, 11572 per year or less are abandoning the field of clinical trials to large trialists that sign several 1572s per year. And this suggests that conducting clinical trials is becoming more complex, and so complex, in fact, that only large centers conducting several trials concurrently can afford the investments to support them. actually you can predict a retrenchment and more conservative application of adaptive and innovative practices as we are now, in a post-pandemic world. So the future will tell us, who is right and who is wrong. Okay, so now I shall pass the baton to Clifton, who is a card-carrying economist and instructor at Harvard, who joined us about 2 years ago, and he will talk about the detection of corrupted and unusable data from wearables at the network level. It's up to you, Clifton.
Thanks, Pierre. Before I pass it off to Clifton, I'm going to launch our final poll of today. So this one is, do you use a platform for aggregation of data from disparate non-CRF sources? So this is our final poll for today. The options are yes or no. Please submit your answers now. Do you use a platform for aggregation of data from disparate non-CRF sources? And final reminder, you can submit your questions here. Right after our final presentation, we're going to dive right into an exciting Q&A session. Perfect. We're getting some good responses in. Just leave this open for another few seconds. Please submit them now. Okay. And with that, I'm going to welcome our final speaker, Clifton. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Sydney and Pierre. Wonderful for many of you to join us today. So what I am going to focus my talk on is on an example of a study that uses AI and machine learning algorithm to detect what are called binary classifiers, that is for data integrity. So I'd like to begin by essentially pointing out that remote health monitoring based on non-invasive and wearable technologies that we've been talking about offers an efficient and cost-effective solution that allows the elderly, for example, to continue to live in the comfort of their home and instead of expensive healthcare facilities. So these systems also allow healthcare personnel to monitor important physiological signs of their patients in real time, assess their health conditions, and provide feedback from distant facilities. So detecting the integrity of the data obtained from these wearable technologies at the network level enables us to eliminate corrupt or unusable data. So in that sense, it also reduces the storage and power requirements of wearable devices without compromising the importance of their functionality. So the data set of the study that I'm going to be focusing on, right, consists of a single lead electrocardiogram records collected using a device called a LiveCore, which is a mobile measurement device. And the data that's captured from this was further annotated by clinical experts into 4 categories. And they include normal rhythm, atrial fibrillation, other recordings, and what's considered too noisy to be classified. So these machine learning techniques are then used to assess the integrity of these signals from the wearable devices. And as you can see here, an example from the figure in the top panel indicates what would be considered unacceptable ECG records, and they will be therefore eliminated. On the bottom, on the other hand, are acceptable ECG record. So these algorithms were trained and tested on the PhysioNet Sync 2017 Challenge Training dataset. All right. And this is a good representation of the data that's obtained from a typical wearable device. Now, this study tested a total of 13 machine learning algorithms. I'm only going to focus on the top 3 performing algorithms that predict ECG signal integrity. Okay, and it's just showing you that there of the 13, I'm only going to focus on the 3 that are bolded here. So the first of these is called a bagging using a neural network simulation. It's also known as bootstrap aggregation bagging. This is an ensemble method whereby a group of neural networks are done through some fairly sophisticated mathematical formulations. So these neural network models are generated by sampling with replacement. And this is at random, of course, on a training data set in order to find the best fitting model. Now, all neural networks in the study follow this structure that you see here. I took it from figure 10 of the article. It consists of 6 nodes of what we call input. You can think of them as variables. 4 nodes of computational layers that you see here called the hidden layer, and 1 output layer that classifies them as acceptable or not. So that's our outcome. Okay. Now these neural network models are found not to overfit the data. And when we say overfit the data, it means that we're not able to predict beyond this data set because it's so fine-tuned to the specific sampling distribution of the data set. So this random sample process, right, found 3 neural networks that seem to exhibit excellent results. And so what the figure shows are that these neural networks that exhibited the best performance in predicting ECG signal did so with about 99.5% accuracy. Okay, so that's the first of the algorithms. Then we have gradient boosting algorithm, the second. So boosting is an ensemble technique in which a sequence of variables are constructed additively to find the best prediction. So this is similar for those of you who might recall from maybe an earlier statistics course, stepwise multiple regression models in statistics, where you look at one variable at a time of your possible predictions to see how that impacts the predictive ability of the model as a whole, with that variable included and excluded. So this ensemble techniques in which sequence of variables constructed are used to find the best prediction. And so at each iteration, a variable is added and the accuracy is checked by noting how many ECG raw values it failed to predict. And so what you see here in the diagram is that the iteration is that the red circles, right, the colored red circles reveal misclassification errors or false negative, if you will, and the blue squares are considered false positives. So that means that the algorithm failed to correctly predict those two. All right. And so this iteration continues until it minimizes the false predictions and is then adopted for a decision tree, which is what's going to follow in the next slide. So they're part of the same algorithm. Okay, so this is decision trees. So decision tree is a learning method in which the important features that can be used to represent data are selected from these regression models. This decision nodes are those that are generated by the iterative procedures you saw previously in the previous slide. The 3 triangles here, right, in this figure, represents the 3rd iteration from the previous slide that produced the least number of false predictions. So the accuracy are for both the training and the prediction stages, respectively. Now, the current decision tree model can be deployed on wearable technology by processing on the chip in real time instead of sending the data to the cloud for processing. So each of these values then in the bottom diagram here, right, are assigned a 1 or a 0 if it matches the raw data. And this ensemble method predicted ECG signal at about 99% and 95% accuracy. Okay, and the important idea here also is that the decision trees requires minimal computing memory and can classify ECG signals with lightning speed. So how do we evaluate costs through these computational complexity? Well, each model has a different energy requirement. based on its computational complexity. So I have circled here in my lasso B2 and GB2. B2 is this bagging with the neural networks, and GB is the gradient boosting with neural networks. And here the computational complexity are determined by the number of multiplications and additions that are used in the algorithm. And the lower energy, right, means lower costs. Okay, so you can see here that both of these require about 99 multiplications and roughly 90 to 91 addition computations. So the total energy required is shown here in the far right, which kind of looks like a p-value if you think about it, right? 0.039, but it's not a p-value. It's a slightly different metric. But what it means is that both bagging and gradient boosting can be implemented on wearable technology at a low cost. Okay, so once again, similar to a p-value, you're looking for the smallest number here on the energy column. Okay, so in conclusion, the neural network ensemble using bagging and gradient boosting exhibit the best integrity classification across all parameters, and computer chips with this energy efficient deep neural networks have the potential to be deployed on wearable devices for reliable ECG signal quality. Right? Thank you very much. And now I turn it back to Sydney to continue on.
Thanks, Clifton. That was really interesting. I'm going to bring all of your colleagues back on now. Thanks for joining back, everyone. Let's jump right into our Q&A session. So the first question we have here, if statistical monitoring techniques are not as effective when the data volume is low, what's the best approach to use for small studies? Anyone can jump in and take that question?
Yeah. This is a question for Chitra, right?
Sure, Chitra.
Yeah.
Take it.
Yeah, maybe I'll take that. Yeah. Yes. So what is important really is to know what checks are required and what things to check for, what things to look for. The methods that you use to detect or identify those anomalies can be different. But that way of thinking, that approach, knowing what to look for can be applied even to the smaller studies, and when there are either small number of sites or when there are a small number of patients. So, you may want to just look for trends rather than doing statistical tests, but they'll still give you an idea of where there could be a problem that needs to be investigated. And then, of course, there are small sample methods to use even in terms of statistical methods that may be more appropriate than the more routine standard methods. And so those are some of the ways in which it can still be handled. The thought process is still very relevant.
Great answer. Thanks, Chitra. We'll move on to our next question here. And this is for anyone who wants to answer this one. Do you have an idea of how the HCPs involved in CTs have embraced their evolving role in the context of DCTs? I don't know. Pierre, do you want to take that one?
Yes, it's a complex question. I mean, would you repeat it?
Sure. There was a lot of acronyms in there. Do you have an idea of how the healthcare practitioners involved in clinical trials have embraced their evolving role in the context of DCTs?
I mean, the short answer is no. I don't have any information on that. We are not, doing clinical trials. We interpret clinical trials. Our job is to interpret clinical trials or results, but we are not a clinical CRO. So I haven't had any recent experience with the evolving role of HCPs. Maybe Danielle has more experience and
Yes,
maybe
I was
better
going to jump
suited
on.
to answer that question.
So, from our experience, medical doctors still want to bring the trial to the site, and I think that's a paradigm shift that is evolving. But they have this personal connection with the patient. However, by enabling pharma to have a glimpse of what's available in the hospital in terms of patients, in terms of profiles that might fit a clinical study, I think that we have found this transition becoming a little bit easier because they are still in control, yet they allow pharmaceutical companies as well as CROs to see their patients in a controlled environment. So we could, think about like this virtualization is helping to pave the way.
Perfect. Thank you. And it looks like we are at the top of the hour, so I think we're going to end it here. Thank you all so much for sharing your knowledge and joining us today. It's really been a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Sydney, and thanks to those who attended.
Yeah, thank you, Sydney.
Yes, thank you all.
Okay, and a big thanks to the audience here for participating. And last but not least, we'd like to thank the sponsor, Actu-Real. Just a quick reminder that the slides and a recording of today's webinar will be available soon. So keep an eye out for the email giving you access to the recording. And before you go, we do invite you to take a moment to share your feedback using the survey that's on your screen now. We do read all of your comments and appreciate your input on your experience today. You can also let us know what webinar topics you'd like to see in the future. And finally, if you do still have questions, you can continue to submit them using that Ask a Question panel, and we'll be sure to pass them on to our speakers. In closing, we hope you enjoyed this webinar, and we look forward to having you with us again soon.